This session, we're happy to introduce a terrific topic, Building to Understand Crown Street Station. This session shows us how a virtual environment can be used to create history in order to learn from our past. In this case, the history of the railway transportation. Peter Miller, our guest, whose avatar name is Graham Mills, is a semi-retired university academic with long-standing interest in education-related applications of OpenSim. He uses the Kitely grid to create his historic references and has created a virtual version of a micrographia that covers the life of Robert Hooke, the Great Plague, and some of the science behind it. I want to welcome Graham, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. As was mentioned, I've recently retired, and I thought it might be fun to do a build related to a building which in fact used to exist on the same street that I worked along. And this is the Liverpool Crown Street station. Now, some people regard this as the first ever railway station. I don't think that's entirely true, but I think the point to make is that it was probably the archetype for all the stations that came subsequently. It's a particular interest and a particular challenge because nothing of it remains to the present day. The railway that connected Liverpool to Manchester was opened in 1830 and it ran for about 30 miles. And the two termini, Liverpool and Manchester, Liverpool is a port. Manchester was a major industrial town, particularly involved in cotton spinning and weaving. And hence there was a lot of interest in being able to move commodities between the two as rapidly as possible. And between the two, there is also a very significant coal field. So again, being able to move coal to the two cities meant that their energy requirements could be readily met. There's no existing buildings at Crown Street, but if you go to Manchester, you can find the old terminus there as part of a museum of science and industry. You can see a nice little Georgian building at the bottom right there, and if you go in there and you climb the stairs, you can get the platform level, and you can see that's a fairly red brick. On the left, you can also see a warehouse. So it was a dual-purpose building serving both passengers and freight. And the point to make is it was also at the actual track is at first floor level because the track had to bridge a river and a street to get there. So it's very different, as you'll see, from the presentation from the structure of Crown Street. With Crown Street, we know almost nothing about the layout of the actual station building. And you'll see that we have a couple of very outline maps. There is two components that we can readily recognize, the station building and a train shed to shelter the carriages. But there are no plans for the buildings, and the maps, as you can see, have relatively little detail. The other thing I would point out is the passenger tunnel, which you can see in the larger map, which the trains took to get on their way to Manchester. So there was a long tunnel that they had to go through, about 300 meters. So we're going to take a journey from Liverpool to Manchester in 1830. Now, just to put some context on that, 1830 is 7 years before Queen Victoria came to the throne. It's 9 years before the invention or the release of the first photographic process, the daguerreotype. So it's really back in the dim and distant past. And what I've been trying to do is to create a series of small builds that reflect what I've been able to discover and what is actually known. This is where the journey would have started for a businessman. The first train was at 7 a.m. in the morning, and if they were traveling from the center of town, perhaps they'd been staying in a hotel, they would have had to go to the coaching office to pick up an omnibus. So these horse-driven omnibuses would take them from the center of the city out to the edge of town where the railway was based. So the coaching office, they would have had to book their seats the previous day, and the mechanism by which the whole system worked is something that is not readily documented, and it's something that I'm quite interested in modeling. The 20-minute journey, about a mile and a half to the station. So here we see the first build of the actual railway. So this is Crown Street Station. We can see on the left the carriages having arrived, and at the foreground you can see the painting from which the build is largely derived. This is by a guy called T.T. Berry, and you can also see on the left-hand foreground the site as it appears now, completely flattened and turned into a public park, which is actually kind of interesting because it means there's actually a lot of space that we could potentially play with. So moving swiftly on, I'll just show you, for the sake of being able to, a model of the build. This is just to remind you how easy it is actually to export mesh built in world. So this is a Collada file that's had a few prims stuck on it to give it some contrast, but it gives you an idea of what you're looking at. Now, what you will see is that there are no locomotives there, and indeed these are the images from which the build was derived. There were in fact two, taken from largely the same perspective. At the far end you can see the tunnel that I was talking about, and in fact the trains left the station under gravity. A couple of guys gave them a strong push and the train ran by gravity down to the next station at Edge Hill. The trains, by contrast, had to be rope hauled into the station using steam engines, which were actually located at the next station. And there are lots of sort of small interesting points that you can derive from examining these paintings. For example, you'll see point one, that there is a displacement of the chimney to the left-hand side as it appears here. And in the second image, you can see that there seems to be a carriage being brought through from the right-hand side. And indeed, there's an entirely different station there called Millfield Station, which again is largely undocumented. We don't know much about the actual organization of the Crown Street Station. So this is all really guesswork. But one of the key features was the need to give a premium experience to first-class passengers. So my assumption is that these people would be welcomed via that impressive portico at the front of the entry space, and they would go through to a service area. And if you remember, the chimney was displaced to one side, and that gives us a clue as to where the fireplace is located, and hence by extension where the actual service counter was. So this is guesswork, but it's interesting, and you know, it has potential, as it were. If we move on to the next place, you can see a contrast between the Manchester booking office and the Liverpool waiting room, which I've located in the next room along. So I've taken one or two features from Manchester and inserted them into the Liverpool build, not necessarily in the same space. It has to be said that the architects for both are unknown, and it's, I suspect, quite unlikely that it's the same in both cases. Another source of evidence comes from a sort of stress test, and this was the opening ceremony on the 15th of September 1830. And what we can see here is the fact that the station at the time would have been incredibly busy. There were some 8 trains encompassing 32 or 33 carriages and about 700 people, all compressed into this relatively small space. And to me, at least, that suggests that there was also use made of the adjacent Millfield station, which you can see on the right, and that this was used to store some of the carriages before that they were run through that tunnel one at a time. The Millfield station is, as I say, largely undocumented. So we see here the carriage and the wagon works, which were on the far side, and in the intermediate area, which was probably used for marshalling and for storage. Now we're going to go a little bit further on, and in fact down the tunnel. So here is the tunnel. On the right, if you look, you can see the yellow carriages moving through the tunnel. On the left is a second tunnel, which in fact is a freight tunnel that goes down to the Mersey docks. So the two entities, the two activities were largely separated. Here we have a build which is recreating the situation at the far end of the tunnel at the Edge Hill part of the railway, which was the next station along. And you can see the so-called Moorish arch, which enclosed the 2 stationary engines. So at this stage, the trains were coupled to the carriages. This sort of representation is actually a situation which would not have occurred early on. We have the yellow carriage, which is first class, and the blue carriage, which is second class. And initially, the two were completely separate. Yeah, it's not a whiskey barrel. Of course, all these things are entirely dependent on the access to water. And it transpires the water, in fact, was also pumped via these steam engines. So here we have some of the intermediate stages of the journey. the passage through this very narrow cutting called Olive Mount. After that, an intersection bridge with another railway, and then also the so-called Sankey Viaduct, which was built not only to maintain a level across the valley, but also to allow the shipping to pass on the canal and the river below. And the Sankey Viaduct is of particular interest because it's still there. So you can walk in exactly the same spot as people did back in 1830. This was actually a very popular excursion situation. People would take the train out to the Sankey Viaduct and go for a little walk there. So roughly halfway through the journey, people would arrive at a station called Parkside, and this was an opportunity for the locomotive to be refueled and re-watered. It's also a famous location as being the site of a fatal accident during the opening ceremony when the local MP, William Huskisson, unfortunately was knocked down by one of the locomotives and died later that day. And then finally, we arrive at Manchester at 8:30, 90 minutes later, and the passengers would dismount. They wouldn't actually go into that station that we saw. They would dismount before Water Street and come down that carriage ramp that you can see in the foreground. So I hope I've given you some indication as to how this can be put together. You can, in fact, most of these builds are on sky platforms. You can, in fact, take a little train and it'll teleport you between the different levels. Hopefully, it may improve our understanding of how Crown Street worked. I think it has potential for heritage and virtual trans tourism, and I can talk, if people are interested, about some educational vignettes, in particular a cholera outbreak on the railway in 1834. I think most importantly, however, I would like to say that it is also a very interesting model, I think, for technology adoption. And this is something that we really need to be up to speed with. There are so many interesting technologies coming along at the moment. I just want, before I wrap, to say thank you to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Trust and Metal at Liverpool for their curation work, which has been invaluable for this project. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Graham. That was a great presentation. Following this session, we have a break in the schedule. Wherever you may be in the physical world. We will be taking an hour break, and you can use that time to explore our different expo areas. Poster booths are in OSCC Expo 3, and the hypergrid resources are in OSCC Expo 2. And then for all of our crowdfunders and sponsors, we will regroup at 11:15 PST in Staff Zone 1 for the VIP keynote Q&A with the core developers of OpenSim. So we will see you back, everybody back here in 1 hour, and I look forward to this afternoon with more great presentations. Thank you.